I say a little bit about the crisis as it affected the UK. I'll describe the Commission and how we did our work. I will focus on the recommendations concerning financial stability, the ring fence, and also greater capital requirements. I will not discuss competition. Part of our job was to make recommendations on competition. I think there isn't time for that, but in questions we could discuss it if you wish. Then I will conclude with some remarks, brief remarks on the how the current Eurozone problems may or may not relate to questions about bank reform. I should say right at the beginning that I'm not here hoping to sell to a non-British audience recommendations that were designed for the British situation. I want to defend our recommendations in the UK context, and I want to argue for the economic logic of our recommendations, but it is absolutely not for me or a colleague on the Commission to make recommendations for other countries which we have not studied closely, so I wish to be clear on that. Banks, of course, as was indicated, are incredibly important for economic life, indeed more than that, for social life as well. Ordinary individuals, small businesses are completely reliant on the continuous provision of ordinary banking services. They cannot easily find alternatives for that, and that is why 3 or 4 years ago, when the system was on the verge of collapse in some countries, including the UK, governments came in with massive support. And in the UK, that support was particularly great. Banks are vital for these economic functions, but unless they are well regulated, they are risky. Any lending is risky, including now lending to governments has risks which are more apparent now than even 2 years ago. Banks borrow short-term, lend long-term, subject to regulatory constraints, so they are at risk of liquidity attacks. So banks are incredibly important, but also potential sources of risk, which makes the problem of how to regulate banks particularly important. UK has enormous banks relative to the economy. The US has enormous banks, but it's a gigantic economy, so in the US, the bank balance sheets are roughly the same size as US GDP. The largest bank, Citibank, its balance sheet, I believe, is around 1/7 of US GDP. UK, you have individual banks as big as the balance sheets the size of a year's output in the economy. So the UK roughly 5 times GDP, US 1 times GDP, France 3 times GDP. This partly reflects the position of London as an international financial centre, but it's not just that, because this is the UK banks, the big banks like Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, doing, particularly compared with 15 years ago, huge amounts of international wholesale and investment banking business, in addition to their regular high street activities. Leverage ratios of those banks, ratio of lending to equity, historically was a number around 20. In the run-up to the crisis, that doubled. So when the crisis was about to hit, you had a very thin layer of equity capital on which these bank balance sheets were resting. When the crisis hit, a number of these banks could not take the losses. So Royal Bank of Scotland, huge bank, is now 80% in public ownership. Not because any government wanted that to happen, but there was no alternative. Lloyds Bank, another of the big four, is 40% or so in public ownership. The government capital injections were just part of the support package, and the effect of this has been a huge shock to the UK. We're not in the Eurozone, we're not so caught up in those issues, but a huge hit to the UK economy and the UK public finances. Output down, well below pre-crisis peak, unemployment up, big fiscal deficit, hence the austerity program. So, against that background, the Commission was set up a month after the May 2010 general election in the UK. That election, as you know, resulted in a coalition government, Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. The banks remain a very hot topic politically in the UK, but this is not in the UK a party political issue. As we shall see, all the main parties in the UK, they've all more or less coalesced around the proposals which our Commission made. And indeed, some of the radical voices are from the Conservative side, indeed the traditional Conservative side, as much as from the Labour side. For example, Nigel Lawson, who was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor of the Exchequer, he would be more radical than our proposals. So it's political but not correlated with party political. 5 Commission members, we are absolutely not political. Some names you will recognise: Martin Wolf from the Financial Times, Bill Winters, he's an American but worked in London for many years. He was, until a year before we were set up, co-head of JP Morgan Investment Bank, so an incredibly experienced, well-respected international investment banker, very, very valuable in how we did our work. Our job was to make recommendations with 2 aims: financial stability and competition, to recommend structural measures, including this question of the split between retail and investment banking, and what were called related non-structural measures, which we interpreted very much in terms of the ability of banks to absorb losses, higher capital requirements, and to make bank debt much better at absorbing losses if there should be future trouble than proved to be the case in 2008. We had to have regard to legal issues, including European law, practicability, how our recommendations would fit into the evolving international regulatory debate, how they might relate to the sluggish economic performance currently, issues of competitiveness, what would this mean for the City of London, and issues about risks and effects on the UK fiscal position. So that was our job.